We'll get started there. So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this webinar this afternoon. I'll tell you a little bit more about the webinar, the purpose, the objectives, and some of the speakers we've got in a moment. But just to introduce myself, I'm Michael Appleby, the Managing Director of Altair Consulting. I've got responsibility for Altair's broad range of consultancy services in the housing and local authority sector, which includes our work in governance and consumer regulation, in transformation technology and other areas, other related areas as well. And just a big thank you for everybody who's joining the call this afternoon, the participants for joining the call this afternoon. Hopefully it'll be a really insightful, interesting, and thought-provoking session. This is the fourth of these sessions that we've run. Each of the other three have been really good so far, so I'm sure that today will be no different. So in terms of the purpose for the webinar this afternoon, so we're all aware that the new consumer regulatory standards came into force on the 1st of April, just a few weeks back, applying to private registered providers and also local authorities. And we're starting now to see some of the first inspections taking place as well. This series of webinars we put together at the start of this year, really to give a bit of a chance to do a bit of a deeper dive into looking at what the consumer standards mean for the sector, and give a real kind of chance to do a bit of a spotlight review of each of the individual elements of the standards, and focus on one standard at a time, with a key objective is really to help build understanding on understanding of regulation and the impact on services to customers in the real world. Keep it quite practical. Want to provide opportunity to do that deep dive. We can hear from some sector experts, get some practical experience from organisations in the sector, as well as how they are evolving and changing and developing their approach to meet the new standards. Keen to keep these series of the series of webinars quite practical as well, rather than conceptual, and also kind of get into that, building a good understanding of what good looks like, share some best practice, and look at the different options that are available for delivering against the consumer standards. So today we're focusing on the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard. Slight mouthful, quite a long one, but transparency, influence and accountability. It's probably the standard that is that arguably kind of makes the biggest shift from the previous standards to the current one. It's one where we've probably got more to get our heads around than some of the other areas as well. So it'd be quite interesting to kind of hear a bit more about that during the webinar today. And it goes without saying, really, how important this topic is for everybody across the housing and local authority sector at the moment, with boards, execs, staff, officers, all really keen to know how to develop, evolve, and change approaches. So we will get into some of that, I'm sure. Setup for today is we've got a series of speakers, which will be covering off some short presentations before we move into questions. So the speakers I'd like to welcome, we've got Anne-Marie Bancroft. Anne-Marie is the Head of Consumer Regulation at Altair. So she's working with organisations across the housing and local authority sector at the moment to prepare for the new regulatory regime, to start looking at what it means in practice, and work through some of those practical implications. Also, Anne-Marie is involved with organisations who are dealing with complaints and working with the housing ombudsman, and also does quite a bit of work in customer engagement in other areas as well. We've also got Joanne Morgan, who is the Director of Governance at Altair. It's worked with organisations on a broad range of governance areas of support, working at board level, and particularly kind of working with organisations previously on ideas, now around looking at inspections and how to deal with the changing approach to regulation as well. And a special welcome to Anne Bijum as well, who is joining us from Thrive, and is the Assistant Director of Customer at Thrive, so has got responsibility for Thrive's customer services, housing and estate services, customer engagement, and customer experience as well. I think Anne's been at Thrive for six years or so, and also got specific responsibility for compliance with the consumer standards, and also the housing ombudsman's complaint code as well. So a lot of practical experience, which I'm sure can be brought to the fore in the presentation today as well. So I look forward to hearing from all three of the speakers shortly. So in terms of the agenda, we've got 90 minutes in total, but each of the other sessions that we've run, we've tended to keep to around about an hour, but we've got the time just in case we need it. We'll kick off shortly with the three presentations, and each presentation will take around about 10, maybe 15 minutes, 50 minutes long, and then we'll move into a bit of a discussion, a bit of a question and answer session as well. The presentations, Anne-Marie is going to give a broad overview of the changes in the changes in terms of regulation. Joanne will cover off a bit more of specific information related to boards and how they should be dealing with this standard. And then Anne will cover off a bit more of a detailed practical overview of Thrive's approach, particularly around data and assurance. We are really keen to make these sessions engaging, so you can ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat function, and you should be able to log questions as we go. We'll probably look to keep most of the questions until the end, turn it into a bit of a panel discussion at the end, but please do contribute as we work our way through. If there's anything specific that we need to deal with immediately at that time, I'll jump in and ask that of the speaker. But please do put forward questions and as we work our way through. We are recording this session as well, so we will be able to publish it, and people who weren't able to make it today will be able to get access to it as well. Or if you know colleagues who'd be interested in seeing the content after you've listened, then please do pass that on as well. And we've got two more webinars after this one coming up over the next couple of months. TSM's is in a couple of weeks, and we'll have a QR code that can be scanned at the end of the session as well, so you can log on to the next webinars as well. So without further ado, I will pass over to Anne-Marie to kick us off with that broader review of the regulatory environment at the moment. Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Michael. If you've attended these sessions before, you would have seen this overview, but it's to provide a bit of context before we have a detailed discussion in relation to the specific standard. I think it's always important to go back to core purpose of all the changes that we're seeing at the moment. Now, the changes to social housing regulation and the regulator of social housing have come about because of the post-Grenfell, and then from an acknowledgement by government that there was a systemic failure of the building, refurbishment and management of high-rise blocks across the country, but as well as identifying some broader concerns about the treatment of social housing tenants and the lack of proactive consumer regulation being one of those key areas. Now, the government's responded in a range of ways, and it's through three key bodies that we've seen this response. We've seen strengthened powers of the Housing Ombudsman, and we saw that very early, purely because there wasn't a requirement to change a significant amount of legislation to provide those powers to the Housing Ombudsman service. But we've seen things like the Complaints Handling Code that was released a good few years back, but as well as being recently turned into a statutory code. We've seen the Ombudsman issue complaint handling failure orders, and their systemic and thematic investigations have been a huge part of discussion in the sector. So that strengthened power of the Housing Ombudsman service has been one of the responses to post-Grenfell. We've also seen the Building Safety Regulator, and this slide purely focuses on the changes for customers, not so much all the technical changes that we would have seen, but things like a requirement for mandatory engagement plans that comes out of the Building Safety Regulator that's set out in safety cases, and the requirement for residents to have a say about buildings about changes to their buildings that affect the safety. Those components have formed part of what is a wider piece in trying to address what is a systemic issue. And then we've seen a change, and this has been the latest change, and it's taken the most time to actually see the change in relation to the RSH and proactive consumer regulation. Now, most people will know that historically, the requirement for the regulator to intervene was set at such a high threshold for consumer matters that only ever focused on serious detriment, and the removal of that serious detriment test has resulted in the regulator being able to intervene in a wide range of ways. Now they've got tools to do that through proactive inspection. So now we see a programmed inspection response, and we also see the requirements, which we will discuss in more detail during this session, the requirement to self-refer being changed, the threshold for that being changed significantly. We've also seen the new consumer standards, but there were historic consumer standards, and I'll run through the difference between those shortly. And the tenant satisfaction and management information measures that have come out most recently, and organisations are actively collecting and reporting to their governing bodies. There is a lot of good practice out there. We've seen things like the National Housing Federation Code of Governance change in response to the identification of systemic failure. We've seen the Together with Tenants programme, and we've seen that tenant trainings happen, and that there's a building safety charter to sign up to. The Housing Ombudsman has rafts of good practice guidance that's available to the sector as well. The key message for this particular point is that alone regulation does not get anyone to an identified place, especially co-regulation. I think it's really important that when organisations look at things like transparency, influence and accountability standard, that they don't just look at it in isolation and have a predominant focus just on what the RSH wants. Equally, the Housing Ombudsman requirements are actually expressly written within this standard, but there is also requirements around the building safety regulator. Engaging with tenants in relation to building safety is equally important as all the matters that sits within the transparency, influence and accountability standard. So when we look at these things together, it's really important to consider from an organisation perspective, how does this work as a mechanism, and how can we deliver it as a whole, not just as a singular point of focus. We have seen that there's been a huge timeline towards proactive consumer regulation, and it has now started. So we're on day 11 of the proactive regime, and we know that organisations have been contacted and are actively experiencing the first wave of inspections, both local authorities and housing associations. We've seen that the tenant satisfaction measures information has yet to be provided to the regulator of social housing. So although they're actively inspecting currently, they're yet to have that full vast wave of information that will come to them by the 30th of June this year. So we are in an active consumer regulatory environment. Things have significantly changed, and organisations need to think about that when they're approaching things. To detail the consumer standards, so the consumer standards, the historic consumer standards were created in 2012, and the historic consumer standards do form a very good foundation for the new consumer standards. And we've seen that the home standard has been translated into the safety and quality standard, which fits the sense of things and the rhetoric around things in relation to safety and quality. We've got the tenant involvement and empowerment standard that's actually turned into the transparency, influence and accountability standard. Wording alone indicates how the regulator wants a real step change in this area. It's not about involving or empowering tenants, it's about having transparency in influence and accountability. Just alone in title, you can see that there's a step change. Enabled and community remains enabled and community, and tenancy remains tenancy. We've got the tenant satisfaction measures standard that is new and implemented, but also the competence and conduct standard, which is out for consultation. So this range of standards is a whole new world for some organisations, because the expectations around them, of which Joanne will detail a bit more, are more enhanced, and the requirements to refer if you don't comply with these standards have significantly changed. So to detail what's in the transparency, influence and accountability standard, in wanting to avoid the phrase cross-cutting themes, this is probably the most cross-cutting standard that exists of all of them, because it focuses on the relationship that providers have with their tenants. It looks at fairness and respect, diverse needs, engagement with tenants, information about landlord services, performance information and complaints, and it has self-referral. at what point an organisation needs to pick up the phone to the regulator to say we've got a significant concern with how we're delivering against the consumer standards. So that's the transparency, influence and accountability standard. The key overview of this is that focusing on treating all tenants with fairness and respect, making sure that you understand the diverse needs of your residents, take their needs into account and deliver equitable outcomes for them. We've recently seen the Relationship of Equals report from the Housing Ombudsman Service, which actually slightly differs to the definitions we've seen in the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard. So in addressing both, there's also a degree of scrutiny that you must have to look between the differences of what both bodies want from you. There's a requirement to strengthen day-to-day involvement and really strict prescription in relation to how to consult with residents. Previously, organisations weren't told about consulting with residents, but the question now will be is if you're going to undertake an activity that has an impact on resident services, mergers, significant change of repairs. There is expectations set now within the standard as to how you should be delivering that message and how tenants should have a say at a meaningful point. There's a lot about information about landlord services, accessing information about rent, service charge and policies, and also who is responsible for meeting the standards. We've seen a massive change in the sector about named individuals. We see it with building safety, and we also see it with information about landlord services and transparency, influence and accountability. Needs to be the ability for tenants to scrutinise services, and unless tenants are fed information, then they're not able to scrutinise services. So there's a requirement about providing that performance information for scrutiny. The complaints processes align with the Housing Ombudsman codes, which I feel quite a lot of us are well versed in the sector now. But the processes expected by the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard are aligned with the Housing Ombudsman Code. Nonetheless, the code had also changed on the 1st of April, which is potentially results in some changes for some organisations. So there is still a requirement to again self-assess. This year, there will be a requirement to submit that self-assessment to the Housing Ombudsman Service. There are hugely strengthened requirements within this standard, and it's probably everything that we would expect post-Grenfell to see that tenants, there needs to be strong and meaningful ways for tenants' voices to be listened to and acted on, and strong and meaningful ways of feeding back to tenants, both when you can do things for them and when you can't do things for them. Being able to communicate when things can't be delivered is equally as important to provide that you said we did process that we see quite a lot in organisations. I'm going to now pass on to Joanne, who's going to go into the detail of things and how things should be expected from a board perspective.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. You can move on to the next slide for me. That's lovely, thank you. And on to the next one, Anne-Marie, as well. So good afternoon. As you are probably aware, many RPs have known for some time that the direction of travel from the regulator of social housing has been very much don't wait for the standards to arrive, start in advance of knowing your customers and knowing your homes. And as Anne-Marie has said, many have had tenant satisfaction measures in place for the past year now. We had the consultation of the standards in October 23, and the standards have been live for a couple of weeks. So the focus today is very much on the transparency, influence and accountability standard. And I agree, Michael, a huge mouthful for us all to get used to. And as Anne-Marie has said previously, the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. So as officers, executive, board, cabinet, you will need to understand your position against the required outcomes of this standard. So fairness and respect, diverse needs, engagement with tenants, information about landlord services, performance information and complaints. Are you compliant? Are you non-compliant? Or are you somewhere in between? But you need to understand your position. You need to understand what the gaps are, and you need to start putting plans in place to address those gaps and thinking about how you're going to communicate this. You also need to consider how you will provide assurance that the outcomes of this standard are being delivered. Have you started to map these out already? I know there's a flurry of activity as the standards landed just before Easter. So have you had a chance to have a look at them and assess where you are already? The evidence you might be required to provide in future could include, for example, do your reports to your board demonstrate relevant consideration and evidence to which there is equitable access to delivery of service? This is just one of the documents that the regulator has suggested is provided as part of the new inspection regime. So officers and exec and boards must also look at the bigger picture and not just one thing in isolation. So if you're considering voids, for example, it's the KPIs, it's any complaints information that you may have, anything from the tenant satisfaction measures, anything from service reviews that are being done in-house or externally provided, any colleague surveys to inform the culture, as well as third-party reports. It all needs to be considered at that big picture level. If you could go on the next slide for me, Anne-Marie, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So data, in terms of data, what information do you have and how will you gain assurance? You need to consider what information you hold to understand the diverse needs of tenants. What percentage of data do you hold and how is that currently being reported to executive and board? Is the board assured that you are providing tenants with accessible information about their rights? And you need to know your tenants to be able to respond to their diverse needs. So it's really taking that step back and understanding what information you have. Do you have, for example, reports showing monitoring by service users protected characteristics, for example? Do you have that level of information available and where is that being reported to? Once the gaps are understood, you need to establish what action is required. So is it starting with collection of the data and then reporting through, or have you already got a lot of that data and is it now about the focus of how you're going to report that through and evidence the action being taken? You need to also consider how information is used to deliver fair and equitable outcomes for tenants and also how that feeds into the delivery of your strategic objectives. So examples of how you tailor services and how this is promoted to your tenants. You need to consider how you will provide assurance that customers are treated with fairness, courtesy and respect. There's going to be a lot of data that you are going to receive to be able to look at this, including complaints data. So there's been a lot of focus, as Anne-Marie said, on complaints over the last year. The Housing Ombudsman shares learning from severe maladministration cases, and the most recent report published this week looks at key themes on attitudes, respect and rights, and includes cases on discrimination, staff conduct and lack of adjustments due to vulnerabilities. So as the Housing Ombudsman advises, you should ensure you are providing learning from complaints, you investigate the systemic and thematic issues, and you also increase ongoing monitoring. So as well as the data, it's also about understanding the culture of the organisation, because culture will be key to the fairness, courtesy and respect and being able to demonstrate that. It's looking at the communication and how you communicate, the tone and the style, and also behaviours. And that can be sought through surveys and attendance at staff events. We've highlighted here about social media and can social media provide useful insights? You may be able to see from this the way, the tone and the manner of responses that are made to tenants, any themes that may be arising and the comments that are provided. And it's another way of doing that pulse check of seeing what is that sort of fairness and courtesy and respect being evident throughout the culture of the organisation. It's also worth considering how the board hears the views as well as receiving insight from data. So the board needs to receive unfiltered views, diverse views, a range of views, as Anne-Marie has highlighted. Many board members do take opportunities to step outside the boardroom, to go and see, to hear and listen, but there's also many that don't, and this should be considered further by boards and the benefits of that. Thank you, Anne-Marie. If you could move on to the next one for me. Thank you. So in terms of decision making, boards have been seeking to hear and act on the views of its customers for some time with varying degrees of success. Many registered providers are revisiting their formal governance structures at this time, which for many is being driven by the increased regulatory focus on consumer matters. Whichever route you as your organisation takes, it must be right for your organisation. There needs to be established mechanisms for the board to hear the customer voice. We have customer committees, operations committees, community committees, homes committees. They're all one optional route through which the board can gain a deeper level of scrutiny and understanding of consumer affairs. But boards need to assure themselves that they hear the voice of tenants at board level, and they need to have a good understanding of the tenants' needs and demands. The RSH will look to assess how well the board has responded to issues that have been raised. So how well do you know your customers and communities? That's the question you should be asking yourselves. Many RPs have scrutiny groups. Our experience from the governance work that we do at Altair, there's some very good scrutiny groups. They're very committed. They're often very small in number and not always offering a diverse range of views. And they're usually in this case, it would be Team Altair. They're usually invested in the organisation and happy to shout about the performance of the organisation. So some questions for you to consider. How effective are the opportunities that are provided? And are the views you hear, are they representative? And do you provide the extent of views being heard in your information that you report through to the board? Does it clearly say that it's actually the views of 20, 30 people, 200, 300? Is that actually clear for board members to establish the extent of views that are being heard? And it's also worth thinking how the tenant voice makes its way through the organisation to the board. Is it being heard and listened to throughout the organisation? I think the important element from the new standard is also about how you report on the influence the tenant voice has actually had. So the new inspection regime, you may be asked to provide for reports on tenant engagement activities, the extent to which these are successful in facilitating tenant influence and scrutiny, and whether there is sufficient accessible support that meets the diverse needs of tenants. It's important to sort of reflect on the involvement that the mechanisms in place for tenants to be able to express their views, and then the influence that has taken. It's also a part of decision making to consider the new requirements of the new standard that Anne-Marie has mentioned a couple of times about self-referral on all material issues that relate to non-compliance or potential non-compliance with consumer standards. Many organisations are familiar with self-referral as part of the governance and financial standard, but this is going to be a new requirement for consumer standards. The key things to remember from a board perspective, from a governance perspective, is it is part of good governance to be discussing whether a self-referral is required. So it's part of the board decision-making process, and it's also an opportunity to display the culture, especially if you're saying that you're open and transparent. So things that you will need to consider when establishing whether to make a self-referral, and this is all new, as Anne-Marie has said, it's very new, we're in very early days and time will tell, but it is about co-regulation. And what you need to consider is the risks to the business and to your customers. It's not just the financial risks, it's the reputational risks and the operational risks. You need to understand the impact. Do you know the full impact? Have you just sort of touched the surface, or have you started to investigate to understand the full impact? Or is it too big already and it's very clear that it's a self-referral is required? So it's understanding the extent. Are we talking, for example, of a small breach of standard, or is it looking much larger and there's some themes arising? And the advice from the regulator all the way along the standards being drafted has been very much, this is co-regulation and please talk to your lead regulator. So that's the advice very much that's coming from the regulator. Thank you, Anne-Marie. If you would go on to the next one. Thank you. So finally, for me, some thoughts around your current self-assessment for those of you that are doing that on financial governance and financial viability standard, but also on the consumer standards. So some of you will be taking your self-assessments against the old consumer standards to your board for approval. So a lot of the old standards remain, and you may be saying in your report to your board that will be due any time that you are compliant with the standards for 23-24. I just ask you to consider if that self-assessment process has been robust, because if there isn't a significant amount of change that we're saying in the new standards and you're saying you're compliant with the old standards, then you need to think about the implications of that going forward. Has there been any external validation of those assurances? Do you know where the assurances have come through? Has it been through the same level of scrutiny as your governance and financial viability self-assessments have been through previously? And are there any areas of non-compliance or partial compliance with the old standards that you have identified? And how will this feed into the plans for the current year, 24-25? Inspections are live, as we've already said, and the RSH is already seeking evidence now. From a governance perspective, a C rating arising from an inspection may well have an impact on your governance grading. For example, if you were awarded a C3, for example, they may come to the conclusion that there has not been enough oversight of consumer impact on governance, and this may have an impact on your governance grading also. Thank you. I'll hand over to Anne now.
Thank you. You can just move on, Anne-Marie, that'd be great. Thank you. So I'm just going to start by giving you a couple of key facts about Thrive. So we were established in 2008. We had just over 4,000 homes as a large-scale voluntary transfer from Three Rivers District Council. Since then, we've acquired some properties and we've developed some properties. And at the end of March last year, we were just under 6,000 homes. And we've got just over 7,000 customers. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a bit today about our new approach to customer engagement. But first of all, just let you know where we were before. Our old approach was that we had what we called Customer Experience Panel, or CEP for short. We had 7 members, 6 of those were customers. So one was a leaseholder, one was a shared owner, the rest were tenants. And we had an independent chair of that CEP. The CEP reported through to our customer colleague and governance committee, but what we were finding is we had obviously a very limited number of people on there, and there wasn't really a diverse representation on the group. At the time as well, so this was back in 2021, there were some other external factors that we needed to consider. So there was like building safety, at the time the social housing white paper. We'd not long had the introduction of the Housing Ombudsman Code, and they all basically highlighted that need to review our customer engagement model to make sure that it was going to be fit for our customers for the future and also for us as a business. We recognised we needed some support with this. We couldn't do it on our own. So we went out to tender in June 2021 for support, and we started our review in July 2021 with Altair supporting us in developing our model. And whilst we started the review in July 2021, it wasn't until May 2022 when we actually went live with it. So if we could just move on, Anne-Marie. Thank you. So what we did was we set up a task and finish group, And on that task and finish group, we had 3 of our former CEP members. We had a group of colleagues, and we had a nominated board member as well who was on there. And as part of that review, the task and finish group, we interviewed customer experience panel members, all of the former members. We spoke to a much wider group of customers. We invited all customers in to get involved in the interviews. And we also had some colleague focus groups and spoke to board about what had worked really well on our CEP, but also, you know, what would people like to see in the future? What did they want that customer engagement to look like? And taking on the feedback of the people who were involved in that review, we decided we wanted to make the principles were to use better customer data. So we were already getting a lot of information from our customers through complaints and feedback, and just general conversations that we were having. And we didn't feel like we were using that as well as we could do. So we wanted to make better use of that customer data through the channels that we'd already got. We also knew that we wanted the engagement to be flexible. Customers were telling us that, you know, they wanted it to be a flexible arrangement so that they could be involved as little or as much as they wanted. And then finally, the third principle was about giving our boards and committees greater assurance that the information that the customer was telling us is influencing the decisions that we're making as a business. Thank you. If we could have the next slide. Thank you. And then the goal of that model, what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we're putting customer engagement right at the heart of the organisation, and creating a customer-centric culture, which is underpinned by respect for the customer and valuing that insight that we're getting at so many different points. Thank you. So this model here, or this sort of circle, it's the cycle of our continuous improvement approach to customer engagement. So what we do is we take our feedback through from our customers through various different means. We look at the data. What's that data telling us? Where do we need to focus? We report on the findings of that and look at areas where we might need to delve deeper to find out where things can be improved. Then what we do is we put the findings forwards to our customer colleague and governance committee with an engagement plan to say how we're going to look into things in greater depth. That plan will then get approved, or there might be further suggestions from our CCG committee. We carry out our activities with our customers. We make the improvements, or we don't make if we don't make the improvements, we mark out why. And then we feed back our customers through to we'll give feedback from the findings through to our CCG, but also through to our customers. And we ask for feedback on the activities that we've done from our customers. So, you know, at that point, if people found out it wasn't a great activity, we could have done it differently, then the customers will let us know, and we can take that into account for next time. So if we could just move on. Thank you. So I'm talking about where we're getting this data from. These are the different channels where we were already getting data. So we do various pulse surveys. We've obviously got the TSMs, the transactional surveys as well that we carry out. We get complaints through all the time. We get compliments. At Thrive also, we do home plan visits, which is a visit to the customer's home where we discuss their tenancy, their aspirations, and look around the home to check out for repairs and so on. And then we also get that ad hoc feedback. Now, what we're doing is we're using the data from these areas to inform the decisions and the areas that we need to focus on as a business. And we feel that this way we're listening to the voices of many customers rather than concentrating on a small number of customers. What we do with the data that we get back is that we put it through, we channel it, we theme it, and then we channel it through like Power BI dashboards. So then we can really carry out analysis and get really good insight there. We know that when our customers are giving us information, it's really important that we listen to that we let them know that we've heard it and that we're closing the loop with them by telling them, okay, this is what we've heard from you, and this is what we're doing as a result of hearing from your feedback. But equally, if we aren't able to change something, then it's important to tell the customers why we haven't changed it. And the home plan visit, I suppose I should say as well, what we find really good about that is it's an opportunity to engage with those customers who might be harder to reach. You can have a good conversation with them. You can explain to those customers, you know, sort of why we want to know, what we're going to do with the information. And we find that that's a great way of building up a bit of a relationship, and then maybe perhaps referring them through to join our customer voice group. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so membership and participation here. This is just to give you a little bit of information about sort of how we've grown over the period of time. When we first started out, like I said, we had the CEP with just the 7 members on there. And over time, that has grown quite significantly. So we originally aimed to have just 50 members on our Thrive Customer Voice group. But then we ran a recruitment campaign. We were going to run a recruitment campaign. And then we thought, well, why are we doing this actually? Because we asked these perception surveys all the time. And one of the last questions in the perception survey was, are you interested in, you know, giving us feedback about other things? You know, are you interested in hearing about ASB or housing options or whatever? So actually, we'll just write to those customers and say to them, like, we've signed you up to our new engagement model, the Thrive Customer Voice. If you don't want to be part of it, by all means, you know, you can opt out. But actually, of that, 2,070 customers remained opted in to the programme. So that's why we've got such a big spike at the point of launch, because actually hardly anybody opted out at that point. With our old model, we've done about 5 activities with a wider group of customers from the CEP. And in 2022-23, this rose to around 6 activities. And then this year we've done sort of 9 additional activities. Now, it doesn't sound like a huge amount, but actually, when you look at the number of people who've participated in the activities, we've got 45% of household members signed up to Thrive Customer Voice, but also we've got 22% of those have taken part in an activity this year. So we're hearing from a really broad range of people, which we're really proud about actually, and it's really quite exceeded what we were expecting in the first place. So if we could just move on, please. Thank you. So talking about what Thrive Customer Voice has influenced this year, we've looked at our approach to damp and mould and how we manage that process. We've done our ASB policy review and co-created a good neighbour agreement. We'd noticed in the data was telling us that the TSM question around whether customers feel safe in their homes, we'd had a little bit of a dip on it. So we carried out a pulse survey with people to ask why was that? What was it that's not making them feel safe? Because there's so many things that can influence that. And customers told us it was about antisocial behaviour, hence looking at good neighbour agreements and the ASB policy with customers, but also on door entries that people were saying that were damaged and people were getting into their communal areas. So it's initiated a really big project on door entry replacement and communal front doors. We've also looked at the annual report content and published, worked on our repairs timescales with customers and got their approval and their input on how long should it be taking us to do repairs. Thank you. So what do our customers think about it? That's the most important thing, isn't it, really? So we've just got some nice things that people have said that they've been, you know, they've really enjoyed, they've noticed it, and they've noticed the change, which is really great. I think one of the key things that's been great for customers is the way that the engagement opportunities are. So we recognised right at the beginning, I said about it being a flexible arrangement. So I think why a lot of customers like it is they don't have to really commit to a big long-term piece of work. You could just read the newspaper, the news articles that we send out if that was all you wanted to do. But actually, if you want to as well, you can do like a short survey, you can do a focus group, you can do a 2 or 3 week session. You know, you don't have to really commit a huge amount of time to it. And I think that's why people are finding it a good way of getting involved. Thanks, Anne-Marie. And then finally, like anything, there are some challenges along the way. I think, like I said earlier, it took us quite a while to implement it. So we started in the July, and you kind of think, oh, it'll be quite simple. We'll just change our engagement approach. But actually, you've got to go through all of these phases, making sure you're getting the feedback, making sure it's what the board wants, making sure it's what the customers want. So it took us nearly a year to implement it. The second thing is data challenges. So I think, like a lot of organisations, we probably haven't got a full set of data, so we have challenges in that respect. We might have to be mindful of the fact that there will be bits of data that are missing about some customers. So we've had to do a big campaign to try and encourage people and incentivise people to share their data with us. Also making sure that when we put data into the system, that it's put in consistently, so that we're able to get the reporting out of the system, which is useful enough to analyse there. In terms of reporting, that was like a really big challenge for us, and it kind of links to the data, really. We need that consistency, and the reporting. What we've done is we've set it up so that we can look at person characteristics to make sure that we've got representative views of people, area, property type, tenure type, tenancy type, and that you can cross-reference these against each other, and making sure that it's representative of your wider customer group as well when you're taking that into consideration. So it was a really big piece, but of work, and it's ongoing as well. So you don't have a one and done on your reporting. It's certainly something that we've developed over time, and we're really lucky. We've been working with our business intelligence team, and they've been really responsive to us in terms of okay, well, we need to change this. Actually, can we add a bit? Can we add something else in? Can we add something else in? All the time. So we're developing that as time goes on. And then lastly, in terms of the hard to reach customers, we've been able to tell through our reporting that we've got great representation on gender, on ethnicity, on areas, and we've got a really good representation on age until the age of about 65, when it starts to not quite be as representative as we would like it to be, at sort of 65, and at 75 plus, again, it's not representative of the wider group. So that's where we need to be really considerate of, okay, we've got a harder to reach group of customers. How do we hear those voices? Do we need to target perhaps something in a particular area that was more convenient for people who are older, or use those home plan visits, like I say, when we're in that customer's home, to make sure that we really are hearing those voices of those customers. So yeah, they've been our challenges, and it's again, like in terms of the analysis, it's a skill that we didn't particularly have in house. We're developing that, but it's an area that we still need to develop further. So we're still learning, but it's been a really great experience, and we're really pleased with the uptake that we've had so far. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to open it up for a panel discussion now. So if anybody, any of the participants have got any questions, please do log them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, just at the bottom of the screen. Just while we wait for a couple of questions to come through. There's a couple of areas I've got. Thank you, first of all, to the three speakers. Really interesting presentations, and I'm particularly hearing about kind of real good examples of what you've been doing at Thrive over the last couple of years is really interesting. That kind of reach out to customers is really impressive and broad as well. Just wondered, it's been in place of the process you've been implementing over the last couple of years. Have you, as you've been taking it forward, and at the same time the kind of the new consumer standards are being kind of developed, and we've seen, have you had to kind of adapt and evolve your approach to kind of meet the requirements of the consumer standards? Did you find that you're a bit ahead of the curve with that, or just wondered through lessons learned through that sort of process, whether you kind of had to adapt and evolve and change things as you moved through?
Well, when we started out, we were aware, obviously, there's going to be new consumer regulation coming through, so that was always, we were mindful of that at the time, and that kind of the journey through of the information through to our customer colleague and governance committee and our board. So that was something we were really mindful of at the time. In terms of changing it, some of the discussions we've had recently about, you know, if you have if the regulator comes in, would they want to see a specific customer, you know, because a lot of organizations still have that kind of panel set up, which we don't so much anymore. You know, we're kind of reaching out further to lots and lots of customers, and we've kind of had discussions of, oh well, you know, should we be still sort of having customers that we have a close connection with? But actually, inevitably, because we run a variety of different types of events, you do get to know the people who are those sort of more committed members. So I think we could kind of reach out to those and say, you always come along, would you like to come and have a discussion if necessary? You know, so you still kind of build up those relationships with your regular people, as well as having that kind of broad reach. But no, I mean, it does evolve all of the time. I was quite reassured from when Anne-Marie Joanne was speaking earlier about kind of looking at the numbers, and you know, when you're reporting to committee and board the numbers of people who are taking part, because that's something that we've been doing sort of naturally, kind of saying we did this activity and this is how many people that got involved. So yeah, in answer to your question, I think it just has to be kind of, we always knew that the regulation was coming. Obviously we didn't know exactly what it was going to be looking like, but we had the guidance of Altair as to what it was likely to look like, so we worked along that way, and then we just sort of evolve it as it goes.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it was interesting I mean, one of the big themes that runs through all the presentations was around kind of data and the importance of data to kind of give that firm foundations, and how sector still got quite a bit to do on data. And you mentioned, Dan, a little bit towards the end about that recognition that you've had to evolve kind of skills in the organisation a little bit. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that. Was that about different rules? Was it about capability building? Was it different tools? Was it different types of approaches? Because it's something that a lot of organisations have to do, is evolve their approach and the way that you use data and analyse it.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly at the start of this process, either we might have just got a business intelligence team, or we were just about to get one. I can't remember how far back, but you know, certainly without a business intelligence team, there's no way that myself and my team have the skills to build Power BI reporting, and even at the early stages, we had to get some support in to build the reporting. We've evolved it further since then, but we needed external support from Altair to help us build that reporting initially. So yes, certainly that the reporting there, so that the team can analyze and actually see what's going on, is really important, you know, and making sure that we are representative. The reporting helps with that. You know, we can look at, okay, well, what does our whole customer base look like, and actually, could we potentially be discriminating against a group? Oh, great, we've got the reporting there to look, and actually, for example, the number of complaints are what you would expect from this particular group. It aligns with the wider population of Thrive customers. So yeah, definitely that was a skill that we brought in, and the analysis side of things, insights analysis, that's an area as well of growth for us, really.
So I'm sorry, Anne, to stick with you just because you were the last presenter. We'll come to Joanne and Anne-Marie in a moment, but I was particularly interested in I think it was the home plan visits. You talked about the home visits, and a lot of the other approach strikes me as being really, really strong and giving that kind of real strong, try and get the right around, kind of quantitative information about customers. You get access to 45% of your customers and a huge number kind of inputting into information, but the home plan visits sound like a real strong opportunity of getting a bit more qualitative information and direct information. Just wondered how you plan those home plan visits. Is it kind of targeted? You mentioned it's about hard to reach groups. Is it certain themes? Do you go there with an agenda of things to talk about, or is it a bit broader? Just wondered if you expand that a little bit more.
Yeah, so we have it. I mean, that's evolved over time, to be honest. We're changing our approach slightly this year to target our more vulnerable customers. But what we do is we do an inventory of the home. So we sort of take photographs. So when we let a home, we do an inventory to look at like what the condition is, how the home was let. and who's living in the home, what their circumstances are, family members, and so on. And then the idea is that you go back the following year and have a discussion with that customer. It's an opportunity if they've got any arrears, or if they've got you might go to a home 1 year and everybody's fine, coping really well, and then go back, you know, a year or two afterwards, and there's hoarding happening, or you know, somebody's got perhaps, you know, alcohol issues or something like that, where they need some support. So the idea of it is you're in their home really for probably an hour. You know, you're seeing how somebody's living, you're hearing about their family, what's going on for them. So it's nice, you know, as you're wandering around looking at any repairs, checking for any damp and mold, you can be having that discussion about, oh, okay, you know, what do you think of our services? What do you think of this? You know, you're having a conversation. It's not just like a tick a box and tell us what you think about a service. You're really getting that in depth, and so, you know, you can drill down that bit further. So we've encouraged our teams to obviously they're recording it on this sort of inventory and any changing and updating any data, that kind of thing, and then you come back to the office, and then we've got a part on our system where you can put in what the person says, and we can theme it, and then again it's kind of like, actually this person wasn't happy about this area, or they thought this was really great. So it's not just looking at the areas for improvement either, it's looking at what do we do well, and can we transfer that over to other services.
All valuable information, isn't it? And good to kind of use it across the organisation as well, rather than that just a specific area. We've got one question coming from the participants around outcomes assessments being quite new for the sector, but not so new in other sectors like health sector. Has Anne seen any good practice examples or published best practice examples that we can use to complete these types of assessments in the housing sector? Marie or Joanne?
And the equitable, I guess it's a choice and an assurance mechanism for a board or cabinet to use equitable outcomes assessments to be able to understand whether their activity has achieved what it wants. It isn't common for the social housing sector, but we have seen that change in tone. So it potentially is something that will be used as a tool in the future. I'm not aware of any published best practice, nor Joanne shaking head approaches either. We do have some sympathy for people, because there is obviously the consumer standards were only finally published in February. But yes, they could be something that we see a trend towards in the future, and hopefully there'll be best practice in that area in the future. But at the moment, there's nothing me or Joanne or unless
still
I'm
early
Michael.
Doors.
Yeah,
still early doors. Great, and still early doors is kind of the new inspection regime as well. But I know some organisations are going through it at the moment. Have we got any insight into any early findings, any kind of early hints or tips that's kind of coming through on inspections where we're looking at the consumer standards?
Should I come in there, Michael?
Yeah.
So we're working with quite a few organisations that got the call before Easter. The same sort of process as the IDAs was experienced for registered providers that they've had previously. So they had the informal call, then they had received the formal notification, and were advised when the scoping document that came out prior to Easter for a number of clients landed just before their Easter break, which set out the documents the regulator suggested they might want to provide, and the assessment focus. So very similar in that respect for the inspection from the IDA regime that we've seen previously. But as Anne-Marie said, a real shift towards the consumer standards. So very little change for governance and financial viability, but whole new section around service outcomes, stock quality, health and safety, maintenance of shared spaces, ASB, domestic abuse, tenancy, all the areas that are there in the standards have come through. and a whole section on what we've been discussing today on transparency and accountability. And some of those examples I gave earlier are documents that clients have been asked to provide, which is yeah, it's a bit of a challenge for some clients when it's only been live for 11 days. But it is sort of, you know, as Anne suggested, you know, the work it's ongoing, and people are continually looking at the best way to hear the voices of the customer, and how that feeds through to the board. And as Anne demonstrated on her slides, it's about the evidence, the impact it's having. What impact is that voice actually having? But having that diversity of voices being heard as well. So yeah, a real shift in terms of focus. Anne mentioned about she was unsure who maybe they would see if they were called for inspection. We have clients that have formal committees and they are observing them. And we have clients that don't have the formal committee arrangements, Anne, and they are looking to speak to an engaged group of tenants. So they are reflecting it to be business as usual for the organisation that they're inspecting. So there's, I don't know whether Anne-Marie's got anything else she'd want to add. In fact, Anne-Marie, we're both on. We've both spent the morning preparing a client for inspection support that they had the notification before Easter.
And for local authorities, there's a slightly different step change. So again, 6 weeks notice, a scoping document, but there is a context document required from local authorities, which sets out the operating context and governance and how the landlord service is governed. So that's been requested for local authorities that are subject to inspection. So slightly different. Obviously, governance and financial viability aren't within the regulatory powers for local authorities. Nonetheless, they are asking about assurance, accountability. You see accountability obviously sit within the transparency, influence and accountability standard, but also looking at mechanisms, lines of defence, what is there to say that particular functions that you can be confident in the delivery of them. So definitely from a private registered provider and local authority perspective, similar approaches, similar scopes, obviously taking away governance and financial viability, to housing, to how things were being done previously, and yes, a key angle for local authorities. So yes, that's our that's in a nutshell our approach. I did just see a message about a context document. Jane, I can see if I can follow up with the local authorities we're working with, and if they're willing to share, and we can provide it to you if they are.
Yeah, and I think in terms of kind of the inspection regime, it's probably fair to say that kind of the regulator will be evolving and developing its approach and learning as it goes as well. And probably what we're seeing right now is probably going to be different in a few months and years to come as well, isn't it? So it'll be kind of a live and developing process as well. Just a couple of the questions from me, and then we'll look to wrap it up. Unless anybody in the audience has got any other questions that they'd like to ask. Just Joanne, want to come back to what you were talking about, and one of the big parts of this standard is around the self-referral element, which we've had in governance viability, but now it applies to the consumer standards as well. And certainly when I've been speaking to organisations, there's been a bit of concern about when is a self-referral, or when is an issue a self-referral, or is it not? And whilst you can't, in this kind of setting, kind of map out an approach which applies to every single instance, have you got any thoughts on kind of guidance? Is it about just keeping good engagement with your nominated person at the regulator? Is it about keeping the communication lines open, or is it about do you go when something just emerges, or do you wait until it's something that you're absolutely got your hands around? Have you just got any general thoughts really about dealing with that self-referral element, which will be quite a bit broader than what we've had previously?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, Michael, and obviously, you know, it's new, so it's a little bit unknown at the moment. And Anne-Marie and I have spent so much time trying to, you know, what is material. That's your starting point, isn't it? It's what actually is material. I think the really good open communication with the board is the starting point. So as soon as something comes to light, it's having those mechanisms to get it up to the chair and to the board, and to have those open conversations with the board as a starting point. It is part of good governance. It is having those conversations. It's understanding the risks understanding the impact, understanding the extent of it. Some organisations, as soon as they become aware of something, prefer to try and understand the impact and then assess the materiality before having conversations with the regulator. The regulator's advice is very much co-regulation, keep in contact, keep discussing, happy to have those conversations. I've heard reference to checklists. Everybody will have their own view on that. I think, you know, for us, it's good governance. It's part of decision making. It's part of your culture of an organisation, and it's keeping those conversations going. But it's, you know, it is understanding what is the impact. You know, what is the impact of it? Is it going to affect a small percentage of customers, or is it, you know, is it affecting 75% of your customers? It's really understanding the impact to understand the materiality. It's not always financial, though. There's that reputational risk to take into account as well. I think as time goes on, we will see what self-referral looks like. I'd be cautious of a sort of, you know, if you answer X, go to Y. I'd be a bit cautious of that approach. So I think it is very much keeping the communication lines open.
Yeah, and that works with the boards and outwards. Yeah. It's a difficult one. We'll find as we kind of move through, there'll be a multitude of different scenarios that kind of come to play with it as well. Okay, so we're coming up to about an hour and 10 minutes. I think we've finished with questions from participants. So I will probably bring the session to a close now, unless there's any last minute additions, which I don't think there is. So just leave left for me to say a massive thank you to the three speakers, Anne, Joanne, and Anne-Marie. We were joking just before the call that we've got a lot of Annes on the call, so I'm pleased that I managed to get that out in one way. Massive thank you, really great presentations, and great to see the broad overview, the specifics around governance, and then the case study in detail from Thrive. So thank you for the time put in, and thank you everybody who has joined the session this afternoon. As I mentioned earlier, we've got another 2 webinars still coming up, and no doubt we'll email out the details after this if you'd like to sign up for those sessions. So thank you everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.